Hey kids, in this lesson we are going to look at the chart wrapper. And the chart wrapper is an object within Google Charts that has a variety of methods to allow us to draw different types of charts on the page using an element with a particular ID. So we're going to target an element with a particular ID. We are going to specify what type of chart we want to draw, and we are going to specify the data table that we are going to use. The good news is that we already have a data table. That's what we did in the last lesson. We created the data table with the columns and rows that we want. So specifying the data table for the chart wrapper is going to be quite easy. So I'm going to take you through the steps necessary to finally draw a chart on the page. Let's get started.
So we have our data table. I don't know that we need to log this anymore, so we won't. Just check and see if we're logging anything. No, we're not. Great. Okay. So we're rendering this JSX, and we have these properties that we defined in our preload function that we are including in our callback. So we can pass these to our application through the callback. So if we specify them here, we can use them within our app. So Google and data table, Google and data table. Perfect. That's point number one. Now we want to get these passed down to our JSX. So we will simply include those parameters, Google, and doesn't really matter what we call this. We'll call this data table, spelling the whole word table, and pass in data table. Okay. So now those will be available in props. So let's use them within our JSX. Let Google equal props.google and let data table equal props.data table. Okay. Now, instead of my Google Charts application, we actually want to start drawing some stuff. So let's create a new component called app, and then import that here into app. Okay, so within our components, we can create a file and we'll call it app.js. Okay, and within app.js, we will first import React, and then we're going to import useState from React. And then we'll create the scaffolding for our app. So const app equals props. We're going to need to pass Google and the data table around through our application because those are the two objects that contain the methods that we need to draw stuff. So we'll export default app, and we're going to return some JSX. For now, let's just do div. And just so we know what we're drawing here, let's have an H3 with main wrapper specified. Okay. So that's enough to import. So we can import app from components app. And if all works out, instead of seeing the previous text, we now see main wrapper. Okay, so our app needs to draw a wrapper. So within components, what we're going to do is we are going to create main wrapper.js. And then for this component, we will import React, and we're going to use useState and useEffect. We want those two hooks from React. And let's scaffold out the main wrapper. Const main wrapper equals props. And no, I don't need a semicolon at the end of this. It'll compile just fine without. Old habits do die hard, though, don't they? Export default main wrapper. And we need to return something so that we don't throw an error. Return div, and we need an ID for this one. The ID we'll call main wrap. And let's have some placeholder text within this div. Loading main wrap. That's enough to import. So we'll import from our app.js, import main wrapper from main wrapper. Okay, and then what we can do is we can call main wrapper. I'm not going to worry about passing props around yet, and it just says loading main wrap. So we have the basic outline of our chart wrapper and table chart set, but obviously this isn't going to, it's not going to do very much. So what we need to do first is pass props down from app to main wrapper, and we're getting those props from JSX, and we're getting those from preload. So we're passing Google and data table down through our component tree. So what we need to do in the first instance is actually specify what those props are, with Google being equal to Google and data table being equal to data table. Okay, excellent. So now we drill down to app.js, and we're gonna use the use state hook here to set these. Const Google, and we're gonna destructure that. Google, set Google equals use state props dot Google and const data table set data table equals use state props dot data table. And you may be asking, why are we using the use state hook here and not just setting a const Google equals props.google? Yeah, we could do that. But because we are now dealing with React components and we are trying to get away from non-React functions or non-functional components, as we were using with preload. So we had a lot of code here which was not of the functional component variety. These are just functions, but not functional components. So now that we are getting into functional component territory and we are using React, we're going to be using use state and use effect consistently throughout our components. So we're going to start being consistent with the topmost component with this app component. So just for consistency, that's the answer. That's why we're doing it. And we are exporting. Okay, that's all set. So all we need to do here is add Google equal to Google and data table is equal to data table. Excellent. So now we need to drill down to main wrapper. And in main wrapper, we're going to be using the hooks even more extensively because we need to specify when it's appropriate for the draw method to be invoked. So what I mean by that is we can draw a component using using the Google Charts method on a chart wrapper. So if we go to the documentation, chart wrapper draw is the first and most important method that is mentioned. So we could play around with this if we have access to data table. We do not. We forgot to, let's see, preload. I think we forgot to add window.datatable. Yeah. So add data table, create data tables. So one thing I like to do here is I like to say window.datatable equals data table. So if we save that, we'll see the reload, and then data table is now an actual object that we can use here. So if we were to say, let, I don't know, main wrap equal new Google dot visualization dot chart wrapper, that takes in an object and shift return, and it has container ID equal to main wrap, and let's see here, shift return, chart type is table, and shift return. Data table is, now we have the data table object, so we can specify that. So main wrap is a new object, main wrap. We can confirm that we actually created something. And then we can say main wrap dot draw. So this dot draw method is the method that we're most interested in getting to. So that's what we're doing here. We need to attach our chart wrapper to an element with an ID that already exists on the page. So we're rendering main wrap, and that's great. We have the target ID, and it'll say loading main wrap until that draw method is invoked. So a necessary condition for having this draw function work is that the target element, main wrap, has to be loaded, fully loaded on the page. Another condition is that we have to have Google and data table available to us. We used Google when we specified that we wanted a new Google visualization chart wrapper, and we used data table when we set the data table for this chart wrapper. So those are the objects that we need, and we need to make sure that we have access to them when we decide to draw against this div. So the first thing we'll do is specify the element, the target element that we are going to draw on. So we'll say const wrap, and we'll use the use state pattern. Set wrap equals use state document dot get element by ID main wrap, or no. So we'll be able to test if we got an element using use effect. Because if wrap is set to null, then it hasn't loaded yet. And we'll say const Google equals props.google. Actually, if we're going to be consistent, let's say const Google set Google equals use state props.google, and then const data table set data table is use state props.data table. Okay. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set use effect, and we're going to have it run anytime anything is changed, which is not a typical pattern. Usually we would set it to run once with an empty array here. But in this case, we don't need it. So we'll just set it to run every time. And we're going to call an async. We're going to specify an anonymous async function. Set wrapper. And notice that it's different than set wrap, which we've already defined. So we'll say set wrapper. Set wrapper. And we'll just immediately call the function. What we're going to do inside of here is we're going to say if our wrap element is not an element at all, but equals null, then we know we have to go out and find it. So we'll let wrap element equal await document get element by ID main wrap. So this will run every time, but as soon as wrap is not null, as soon as it is equal to an element document get elements by ID, then this code will not execute. So what we need to do is make sure that we actually set that. So we'll use the hook that we set up above. We'll say set wrap lem. Okay. Now, what happens when our wrap, when the state changes from null to an actual element? Well, we want something else to happen. We want to create the chart wrapper in the same way that we did here. We want to create a new chart wrapper. And then we want to call, just like we did here, we want to call draw. So we're going to use effect again. And here we will specify our dependency for this hook. And our dependency is hooked to the wrap element. And when wrap updates its state, we can check again to make sure wrap is not null. If wrap equals null, then we'll let wrap lem equal document get element by ID main wrap, and we'll let wrapper equal new Google visualization chart wrapper. We'll set the container ID just as we did in the console to main wrap. Set the chart type to table and set the data table to data table. And then call wrapper.draw. If wrap is not null, but if it's not null, then we can simply include the latter parts of that block there. And we see that we have our desired effect set up the way we expect. So it'll say loading main wrap, and then it'll right over that element. So we've specified the div ID of main wrap. The content only says loading main wrap until we call wrapper.draw. And just to condense this, let's take out all that code, get rid of the else statement. It's all we really need. So we don't need wrap-lm. That was actually a holdover from up above where we defined that. Okay, so that was a bit of code that just lingered, got copied and pasted from one location to another. All right, good. So if the wrap equals null, and actually we can condense this further. We can just say, since we're in either case going to, if wrap is null or if wrap is not null, we're going to create a new chart wrapper. So we actually don't even need that conditional. Okay, now we're cooking with gas, as they say. Anytime this is available to us, we are going to create our chart wrapper. We are going to specify the data table, and we are going to draw. And there we go. So what we were able to do in this video was draw the chart wrapper by creating a new component, the main wrapper. We passed data table and Google down through the component tree until we got to main wrapper. Then we used Google and data table in the construction of the chart wrapper because we rely on Google and its various methods, and we rely on the data table to specify the data that we want to attach to the table chart type. And then we invoke the method of drawing on the chart wrapper. So a lot depends on having Google and data table available whenever we need them. And rather than do something like rely on, say, const equal d table equals window dot data table or something like that, what we're choosing to do instead is pass data table down through the component tree. In the next few videos, we are going to introduce the Google Charts dashboard and the various controls that are available. So stick around, we'll be creating selects, drop downs, text input to filter the data, or perhaps by last name. So we'll be creating those controls and that dashboard element in the next videos, and see you then.